Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the exploration vessel New Horizon and watched the stars through the main screen. The ship had been flying through empty space for weeks on a normal survey mission. They were mapping new star systems in the outer regions where no human had gone before. It was quiet work but important for expanding human knowledge of the galaxy. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez sat at her station monitoring deep space communications. She had been doing this job for 3 years and knew the difference between normal space noise and something unusual. On this day, something very different came through her equipment. At first, she thought it might be a malfunction, but the signals kept coming. They were weak and broken, but clearly not natural. Amy called out to Captain Morrison with worry in her voice. She had never heard anything like what was coming through the speakers. The sounds were not human, but the universal translator was working hard to make sense of the patterns. Slowly, words began to form from the strange signals. The message was a cry for help. Someone far away was asking for rescue. The beings calling themselves the Kalari were facing death on a massive scale. Their star was dying much faster than it should, and they did not have the technology to save themselves. 2 billion lives were at risk and time was running out. Commander Lisa Hayes joined Morrison at the communications station. She was his most trusted officer and had seen many difficult situations during her career, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. An entire civilization was crying out across the void, hoping someone would hear them. The Kalari message had been broadcasting for months. Each transmission was weaker than the last as their power systems failed. They described their world in simple terms that the translator could handle. Cities of crystal and metal stretched across 3 continents. Families holding each other as their star grew unstable. Children who would never grow up if help did not come soon. Morrison studied the star charts with growing concern. The Kalari system was 3 months away, even at the fastest speed their ship could manage. It would take a massive effort to mount any kind of rescue mission. His single ship could maybe save a few thousand beings, but there were 2 billion people waiting for help. Hayes looked at the data streaming in from the Kalari world. Their technology was advanced in some ways, but they had focused on exploration and science rather than building large transport ships. They had beautiful vessels that could travel between stars, but nothing that could carry millions of refugees to safety. The captain made his decision quickly. He ordered Amy to send an immediate message back to Earth Command. Every detail about the Kalari situation needed to reach headquarters as fast as possible. If there was any chance to help these people, then humanity had to know about it right away. Back on Earth, it was late at night when Admiral P. Collins received the urgent transmission. He was a career military officer who had seen many crises, but this was completely new. First contact with an alien species was something humans had dreamed about for centuries. Now it was happening, and the aliens needed help desperately. Collins woke up President Helen Carter and her emergency cabinet. The meeting that followed would change human history forever. The debate was intense but short. Some advisors worried about the cost and risk of such a massive mission. Others questioned whether humans should get involved in alien affairs. Dr. Susan Miller was Earth's top expert on the possibility of alien life. She had spent years preparing for first contact, but always imagined it would be peaceful meetings between equals. Now she was studying biological data from the Kalari, transmissions trying to understand how to keep alien refugees alive on human ships. Engineer Tony Adams ran calculations on what it would take to evacuate 2 billion beings across interstellar space. The numbers were frightening. It would require every ship in the human fleet working together. Even then, they could only save a portion of the Kalari population before their star destroyed everything. President Carter addressed the world early. The next morning, her speech was broadcast to every nation and colony. She spoke about humanity's values and what it meant to be the good guys in a dangerous universe. The decision was made. Earth would mount the largest rescue mission in human history. The response from around the world was immediate and overwhelming. Every spacefaring nation offered their ships and crews. Commercial companies volunteered their cargo vessels. Military fleets prepared to leave their normal duties and join the rescue effort. In less than a week, the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled was taking shape. Captain Danny Foster received orders to take command of the rescue fleet. His heavy cruiser Valiant would serve as the flagship for hundreds of ships heading into the unknown. Foster was a veteran of the Mars colonies, who had led difficult missions before, but nothing on this scale. Lieutenant Colonel Mary Jones was chosen to lead the ground teams that would organize the evacuation. She studied everything known about Kalari society from their transmissions. Learning their customs and social structure would be critical to making the rescue work smoothly when every minute counted. Dr. Kevin Wright became the fleet's chief medical officer. He had to prepare hospitals that could treat beings whose biology was completely different from humans. Working with only theoretical knowledge, he designed medical equipment and procedures for patients he had never seen. Rachel Torres oversaw converting cargo ships into refugee transports. Each vessel needed life support systems that could keep Kalari alive during the long journey to safety. Food production systems had to be modified to create nutrition that alien biology could process. Captain Morrison's New Horizon was designated as the advanced scout ship. They would push their engines beyond normal limits to reach the Kalari system ahead of the main fleet. Their job was to make first contact and begin planning the evacuation before the larger ships arrived. As the rescue fleet prepared to depart, every person involved understood the stakes. They were not just representing Earth, but showing the galaxy what humanity stood for. When faced with suffering on an unimaginable scale, they chose to risk everything to help complete strangers. The journey would take 2 months at maximum speed. Every ship would be pushed to its limits and beyond. But across the fleet, from the biggest battleship to the smallest transport vessel, the crew shared the same purpose. They were going to save as many Kalari as possible or die trying. Admiral Collins stood on the command deck of the massive carrier, Freedom, and watched as nearly 300 ships formed up around him. It was a sight that would have been impossible just weeks before. Now it represented the best of what humanity could accomplish when faced with a crisis that demanded everything they could give. The news of the Kalari crisis spread across Earth like wildfire. Within hours of President Carter's announcement, every major spaceport buzzed with activity that had never been seen before. Ships that had been sitting in repair docks for years were suddenly getting emergency fixes and upgrades. Military vessels that were scheduled for routine maintenance found themselves being rushed back into service. Captain Danny Foster arrived at Luna Station to take command of his new flagship. The heavy cruiser Valiant was one of the most powerful ships in the human fleet. It could carry 50,000 refugees in emergency conditions, but that number seemed tiny compared to 2 billion Kalari who needed rescue. Foster walked through the ship's corridors and saw his crew working around the clock to prepare for the mission ahead. The conversion of civilian ships into rescue vessels was happening at every human facility. Cargo haulers that normally carried mining equipment were being fitted with life support systems for living beings. Passenger liners had their luxury cabins stripped out to make room for emergency shelters. Every available space was being modified to house Kalari refugees. Lieutenant Colonel Mary Jones studied the Kalari transmissions from her temporary office at Earth Command. She was learning everything possible about alien society from the desperate messages they were sending. The Kalari seemed to have a complex but organized social structure. They had families like humans but lived in larger community groups. Their cities were built around central gathering places where important decisions were made. The cultural information was critical for planning the evacuation. Jones needed to understand how Kalari would react to human rescuers. She learned that they valued honor and sacrifice highly. Many of their messages mentioned elderly Kalari volunteering to stay behind so younger ones could escape. This suggested they would cooperate with rescue efforts even under extreme stress. Dr. Kevin Wright worked in the medical research labs preparing for the biggest challenge of his career. He had to design medical equipment that could treat beings whose bodies were completely different from humans. The Kalari were silicon-based life forms with crystalline skin and 4 arms. Their internal organs worked in ways that were totally alien to human medicine. Wright and his team studied every piece of biological data from the Kaleri transmissions. They discovered that Kaleri could breathe the same air as humans with minor adjustments. Their body temperature was slightly higher but not dangerously so. The biggest challenge was their diet, which consisted of mineral compounds that human food systems could not normally produce. Engineer Rachel Torres had the enormous job of converting hundreds of ships for refugee transport. Each vessel needed sleeping areas for thousands of beings who were taller than humans and had different physical needs. The Kaleri messages included basic information about their body size and preferred living conditions. Torres used this data to design refugee quarters that would keep aliens alive during the long journey to safety. The food production problem was solved by modifying industrial fabricators to create the mineral-based nutrition that Kaleri needed. These machines could break down raw materials and rebuild them into edible compounds. It was not ideal, but it would keep the refugees fed during their journey to new homes. Captain Morrison pushed the New Horizon harder than any ship had been pushed before. They were racing ahead of the main fleet to reach the Kaleri system first. Every day of advance warning could save thousands of lives when the evacuation began. Morrison's crew worked in shifts around the clock to keep the engines running at dangerous speeds. The strain on the New Horizons systems was enormous. Chief Engineer Bob Turner reported multiple failures every day. The warp core was running far beyond safe limits, and the hull was showing stress fractures from the constant high-speed travel. But Turner and his team kept everything working through determination and creative repairs. Back in Earth space, the main rescue fleet was taking shape. Admiral Collins watched from the bridge of the carrier Freedom as ships arrived from across human territory. The sight was incredible and frightening at the same time. Nearly 300 vessels of every size and type were gathering for a mission that had never been attempted before. The fleet included everything from massive military battleships to small civilian transports. Each ship had volunteered for a mission that might cost them their lives. The journey to Kaleri space would push every vessel to its limits. Many ships might not survive the trip, but their crews were willing to take that risk. Military planners worked day and night to organize the fleet for maximum efficiency. Fast ships would carry medical supplies and emergency equipment. Large transports would focus on moving the greatest number of refugees. Support vessels would provide fuel and repairs during the long journey. Every ship had a specific role in the massive rescue operation. The human colonies also contributed everything they could. Mars sent its entire merchant fleet along with volunteers to serve as crew. The asteroid mining stations provided raw materials for ship repairs and refugee supplies. Europa Base contributed its best engineers and medical personnel. It was a combined effort by all of humanity. Dr. Susan Miller finally received detailed biological scans from the Kaleri homeworld. The data showed that silicon-based life was more similar to human biology than anyone had expected. Kaleri could survive in human ship environments with only minor atmospheric changes. Their four-armed bodies were graceful and strong. Their crystalline skin could change color to show emotions. The psychological profiles were just as important as the physical data. Kaleri society valued community cooperation and personal sacrifice for the greater good. They were peaceful beings who had never fought wars between their own kind. This meant they would likely follow evacuation procedures without panic or resistance. Training programs were established for all rescue personnel. Humans needed to learn basic Kaleri communication gestures and cultural customs. The aliens had specific rituals for greeting strangers and showing respect to leaders. Understanding these customs would help the evacuation proceed smoothly when every minute counted. As departure day approached, the rescue fleet conducted final system checks and loaded supplies. Each ship carried enough food, water, and medical equipment for the long journey ahead. Fuel reserves were calculated down to the last drop. There would be no chance for resupply once they left human space. The crew said goodbye to their families knowing they might never return. This was the most dangerous mission in human history, and everyone understood the risks. But across the fleet, from commanders to junior crew members, the determination was absolute. They were going to save as many Kaleri as possible, no matter what it cost them personally. The New Horizon dropped out of warp speed at the edge of the Kaleri system, and Captain Morrison could hardly believe what he saw. The dying star pulsed with angry red light that painted everything in an eerie glow. 7 planets orbited the unstable star, and the 4th one was home to 2 billion souls who were running out of time. The star's surface churned with violent flares that shot deadly radiation across the entire system. Morrison ordered his crew to begin deep scans of the system while they approached Helaris Prime. The planet itself was beautiful despite the crisis surrounding it. 3 continents covered with glittering cities could be seen from space. The Kaleri had built their civilization using crystal and metal that caught the starlight in amazing patterns. But even from this distance, the signs of trouble were clear. Power grids across the planet were failing as the unstable star disrupted their energy systems. Some cities had gone completely dark while others flickered like dying candles. The Kaleri were losing their ability to maintain their technology just when they needed it most. Without power, they could not run their communication systems or operate. Their limited spacecraft. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez worked frantically to establish contact with the planet's surface. The solar interference made communication difficult, but she finally managed to reach the Kaleri government center. The first alien voice that humans had ever heard came through the speakers with a mixture of hope and desperation that needed no translation. Chancellor. Vextal appeared on the main screen, and Morrison got his first look at a living Kaleri. The alien leader stood nearly 8 feet tall with skin that looked like living crystal. 4 graceful arms gestured as he spoke, and his large, multifaceted eyes reflected the red starlight streaming through the windows behind him. Despite his alien appearance, there was something unmistakably intelligent and noble in his bearing. Vex. Tal's first words to humanity became historic. He spoke slowly so the universal translator could process his language correctly. He told Morrison that the Kaleri had broadcast their distress call without real hope that anyone would hear it. The galaxy seemed empty and silent until humans answered their cry for help. That strangers would travel across the void to aid people they had never met was beyond what the Kaleri had dared to dream. The Chancellor explained the situation in simple terms that both species could understand. The Kaleri star was collapsing ahead of all scientific predictions. Solar flares were growing stronger every day and would soon make the planet uninhabitable. Within months, the star would explode and destroy everything in the system. Their own ships were beautiful, but designed for exploration rather than mass evacuation. Morrison assured Vextal that help was coming. The largest rescue fleet in human history was racing toward their system at maximum speed. Hundreds of ships were being prepared to carry Kaleri refugees to safety. But even as he spoke these reassuring words, Morrison knew the terrible truth. There was not enough time or space to save everyone. Commander Lisa Hayes worked with the Kaleri engineers to identify the best locations for evacuation sites. The alien population was spread across 3 continents, with the capital city of Arxes holding nearly 500 million beings. Other major cities contained millions more, while smaller settlements dotted the landscape. Every location would need to be reached before the star's final collapse. Chief Engineer Zara next became Hayes' primary contact on the planet's surface. The female Kaleri was brilliant and practical, with a deep understanding of her people's needs. She had been preparing evacuation lists for months, even when there seemed to be no hope of rescue. Now she worked day and night to organize her people for the massive undertaking ahead. Dr. Susan Miller finally had the chance to study living Kaleri. Instead of just data transmissions, she was amazed to discover that silicon-based life was more adaptable than anyone had expected. Kaleri could breathe human ship atmosphere with only minor adjustments to oxygen levels. Their body chemistry was different but not incompatible with human medical knowledge. The cultural exchanges were just as fascinating as the biological discoveries. Kaleri society was built around extended family groups that functioned like small communities. They made decisions through discussion and consensus rather than having single leaders give orders. This meant that evacuation planning had to involve thousands of small group leaders rather than just government officials. Lieutenant Colonel Mary Jones landed with the first advance team to begin organizing evacuation procedures. The Kaleri had prepared for her arrival with remarkable efficiency. Family groups had already selected their most precious possessions and cultural artifacts. The elderly had volunteered to remain behind so that younger Kaleri could escape to safety. Jones was struck by the dignity and courage of the Kaleri people. Despite facing the end of their world, they maintained their social customs and treated the human rescuers with formal courtesy. Children stayed close to their parents but watched the humans with curious eyes. Adults asked detailed questions about the evacuation process while remaining calm and cooperative. The Kaleri cities were unlike anything humans had ever seen. Buildings grew from the ground like crystal formations with internal spaces that flowed together in organic patterns. Transportation moved through tubes that connected different levels and districts. Parks contained plants that looked like living jewels under the dying star's strange light. Captain Morrison established a command center in Arxes to coordinate with local authorities. The Kaleri government worked around the clock to compile complete population records and assign evacuation priorities. They organized their people into manageable groups and designated assembly points where human shuttles could land safely. As the hours passed, the star's condition continued to worsen. Solar flares grew stronger and more frequent. The planet's magnetic field was beginning to weaken under the constant bombardment of radiation. Time was running out faster than anyone had calculated, and the main rescue fleet was still days away from arriving. Vextal made a difficult announcement to his people. He explained that the humans were coming to help, but that not everyone could be saved. The star's collapse was happening too quickly for a complete evacuation. Some Kaleri would have to stay behind and face death so that others could live. The response from the population was heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time. Families held meetings to decide who would go and who would stay. The elderly insisted that the young should be saved first. Parents prepared to send their children away while remaining behind themselves. Communities selected their best and brightest to preserve Kaleri knowledge and culture among the stars. It was sacrifice on a scale that Morrison had never witnessed before. The advance evacuation began with the most vulnerable populations. Kaleri children and pregnant females were loaded onto the few human shuttles available. Each flight could only carry a few dozen beings, but every life saved was precious. The shuttles flew continuous missions between the planet and the new horizon while everyone waited for the main fleet to arrive. The arrival of the main rescue fleet was a sight that brought tears to both human and Kaleri eyes. Nearly 300 ships dropped out of warp speed at the edge of the dying system and immediately began moving toward Caloris Prime. Admiral Collins stood on the bridge of the carrier, Freedom, and watched as his massive fleet spread out across space like a protective shield around the doomed planet. Captain Danny Foster coordinated the evacuation from his flagship, Valiant, while shuttles began their endless flights between the fleet and the surface. Every ship in the rescue force launched their small craft to maximize the number of refugees they could lift from the planet. The sky above Caloris Prime filled with human vessels racing against time to save as many lives as possible. The evacuation proceeded with military precision, but the numbers were frightening. Lieutenant Carl Davis ran calculations on the new horizon and delivered news that everyone dreaded. At their current rate, they could save perhaps 60% of the Kaleri population before the star went critical. That still meant leaving 800 million beings behind to face certain death. The news hit the fleet like a physical blow. In the cramped refugee quarters of the transport ship Mercy, Kaleri families held each other close while human crew members worked with tears streaming down their faces. Everyone understood that they were racing against impossible odds, but nobody was willing to give up or slow down. Dr. Kevin Wright treated his first Kaleri patients in the medical bays of the Freedom. The silicon-based beings responded well too. Human medical techniques, but their injuries from radiation exposure were severe. The dying star was bombarding the planet with deadly energy that was slowly killing everyone on the surface. Time was running out in more ways than one. Commander Lisa Hayes studied the star's collapse patterns and made a desperate suggestion to Admiral Collins. If they could somehow stabilize the star's death process, even for a few weeks, they might complete the evacuation. It would require flying ships dangerously close to the stellar surface and using experimental technology that had never been tested on this scale. Ellen Parker worked with Calleri scientists to develop a stabilization plan. They would use the combined power cores of 30 large ships to create a massive gravitational field around the collapsing star. The artificial gravity well would act like a cage to slow down the stellar collapse and buy precious time for the evacuation to continue. The mission was essentially suicidal. The volunteer ships would have to maintain position in the star's outer corona, where temperatures reached millions of degrees. Even with maximum shield power, most of the crews would not survive long enough to complete their mission. But without the extra time, 800 million Calleri would die anyway. Captain Foster called for volunteers from across the rescue fleet. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every ship wanted to participate in the stabilization mission, but only the largest vessels with the most powerful shields could survive long enough to make a difference. 30 ships were selected from hundreds of volunteers. Among the volunteers was Commander Hayes, who transferred from the New Horizon to the heavy cruiser Guardian. As she said goodbye to Captain Morrison, she managed to smile despite the fear in her eyes. She told him to make sure the history books recorded that they did not go quietly into the darkness, but fought until the very end. Engineer Tony Adams worked around the clock to modify the volunteer ship's power cores for the stabilization attempt. The modifications were dangerous and untested, but they offered the only hope of buying more time. Each ship would channel its entire power output through specially designed emitters that could project gravitational fields across interstellar distances. Meanwhile, the evacuation continued at a frantic pace. Every minute counted, and every ship that could carry refugees was pushed to absolute maximum capacity. Calleri families were separated as children were loaded onto the first available transports. Parents stayed behind to help with the evacuation while their young ones traveled to safety among strangers. Lieutenant Colonel Mary Jones organized the ground teams with ruthless efficiency. Calleri civilians were processed through evacuation centers as quickly as possible while maintaining some dignity and order. The aliens cooperated fully, even though many knew they would never see their families again. Their courage in the face of certain death inspired the human rescuers to work even harder. Chancellor Vextal remained on the planet's surface to coordinate with his government officials until the very last moment. He walked through the evacuation centers, offering comfort to his people while maintaining communications with the human fleet. His calm leadership helped prevent panic even as the situation grew more desperate each hour. The stabilization fleet moved into position around the dying star while refugee transports continued their desperate flights. Captain Foster led the Guardian and 29 other ships toward the stellar surface, where temperatures and radiation levels would kill them all within hours. Every volunteer knew they were flying to their deaths, but they did it willingly. The ships formed a complex pattern around the star's equator, with each vessel maintaining precise distance and heading. Their combined shield generators created a shimmering barrier against the incredible heat and deadly radiation streaming from the collapsing stellar core. The sight was beautiful and terrible as 30 ships prepared to sacrifice themselves for strangers on the planet below. The evacuation entered its final phase. Calleri refugees filled every available transport while others waited hopefully for rescue that might never come. The elderly and sick had already accepted their fate but continued helping load the young and healthy onto human shuttles. Their sacrifice was willing and dignified. Foster's voice crackled over the communications system as the stabilization attempt prepared to begin. He reminded all ships to synchronize their power cores on his signal and maintain position no matter what happened to their shields or hull integrity. They only needed to buy a few more hours, but those hours could save millions of lives. The gravitational cage activated, and for a brief moment it seemed to work. The star's violent pulsing calmed slightly, and the deadly solar flares subsided. In that window of relative stability, the evacuation fleet managed to lift nearly 2 million more refugees from the doomed planet. Every transport was packed beyond safe capacity, but nobody complained. But the star's collapse could only be delayed, not prevented. The volunteer ships began taking massive damage as their shields failed under the incredible stress. One by one, they sent final messages to the fleet before being consumed by stellar fire. Each ship that died bought precious minutes for the evacuation to continue. The Guardian was among the last ships to maintain position as the others fell around them. Commander Hayes sent regular updates to Morrison as her ship systems failed. One by one, she reported successful evacuation of several more city districts before her final transmission cut to static, and the Guardian vanished in a burst of light. The stabilization field held longer than anyone had dared to hope, but the cost was terrible to watch. One by one, the volunteer ships were consumed by the dying star's fury as their shields collapsed under impossible stress. Captain Foster watched from the Guardian's bridge as his fellow captains sent their final messages before vanishing into balls of fire and light. The heavy cruiser Defender was the first to fall when her power core overloaded trying to maintain the gravitational field. Captain Rick Stone's last words were a simple acknowledgement that his sacrifice had bought them another hour. The transport ships used that precious time to lift thousands more Kalari refugees from the planet's surface. Commander Hayes felt her own ship shuddering as the Guardian's hull began to buckle under the stellar radiation. Her engineering teams worked frantically to keep the power flowing to the stabilization equipment even as sections of the ship lost atmosphere and artificial gravity. She walked through the corridors encouraging her crew, while knowing they would all die within the next few hours. On the planet below, Chancellor Vex Tall stood in the capital's main evacuation center as the last groups of refugees boarded human shuttles. He had chosen to remain behind with a skeleton crew to maintain communications until the very end. His duty was to his people, and he would not abandon his post while a single Kalari remained on the doomed world. The evacuation had become a desperate race between the stabilization fleets, sacrifice, and the number of lives that could be saved. Every transport ship was packed far beyond safe capacity, but nobody complained about the cramped conditions. Kalari families pressed together in cargo holds and corridors while human crew members shared their own quarters with refugee children. Admiral Collins coordinated the final phase from the Freedom's command center. His massive carrier was loaded with over 200,000 Kalari refugees in spaces designed for half that number. Similar scenes played out across the entire rescue fleet as every available cubic meter was used to house the survivors of a dying world. The star's collapse was accelerating despite the stabilization efforts. Solar flares grew stronger and more frequent as the stellar core continued its inevitable collapse toward a supernova explosion. The volunteer ships were buying time with their lives, but even their heroic sacrifice could not stop the forces of nature forever. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez maintained communications with the Guardian until the very end. Hayes reported that evacuation had been completed in the final city sectors, before her ship's communication array was destroyed by a massive solar flare. The Guardian continued transmitting automated signals for another 20 minutes before those two went silent. Captain Morrison watched from the new horizon as the last of the stabilization ships was consumed by stellar fire. The artificial gravitational field collapsed, and the star immediately resumed its violent death throes. Solar flares erupted across the system with deadly radiation that would make the planet uninhabitable within hours. The final shuttle flights lifted the last refugees from Calaris Prime as the planet's surface began to glow from radiation bombardment. Chancellor Vextal was among the very last to leave his world along with a small group of government officials who had stayed to coordinate the evacuation until the final moment. Their shuttle barely escaped as the planet's atmosphere began to burn. Foster's voice came over the communication system one last time as the Guardian's shields finally failed completely. He reported that the mission was accomplished and ordered all rescue ships to clear the danger zone immediately. His final transmission was a simple acknowledgement that they had bought the evacuation fleet the time it needed to save millions of lives. Morrison gave the order for the entire rescue fleet to jump to warp speed and begin the long journey back to human space. Behind them, the Calliari star finally collapsed into a brilliant supernova that lit up the entire region of space. An entire solar system vanished in minutes, but the civilization that had lived there was now safely aboard human ships. In the cargo holds and refugee quarters of 300 ships, nearly 2 billion Calliari began their journey to new homes among the stars. They carried with them memories of their lost world and the knowledge that when they cried for help across the void, humanity had answered without hesitation or thought of reward. Vextal stood on the observation deck of the Freedom as the supernova's light faded behind them. The former chancellor of a dead world now led his people into an uncertain future among strangers who had become their saviors. Admiral Collins joined him at the viewing port and placed a gentle hand on the alien's crystalline shoulder. Collins spoke quietly about finding the Calliari a new home where they could rebuild their civilization. There were several worlds in human space that could be terraformed to meet their needs. The refugees would not be homeless for long if humanity had anything to say about it. Vex Tal's multifaceted eyes reflected the starlight as he replied with words that would echo through history. He told Collins that the Calliari had learned that home was not just a place, but the kindness of strangers who become family. Humanity had given them more than a new world by showing them what it meant to be truly alive among the stars. Dr. Susan Miller worked with Calliari scientists aboard the research vessel Discovery to preserve their civilization's knowledge and culture. The refugees had brought data crystals containing their history, literature, and scientific discoveries. This priceless information would help them maintain their identity while adapting to life in human space. The journey back to Earth took 2 months, but the time was used wisely. Human and Calliari worked together to plan the new colony world that would become their shared home. The aliens adapted quickly to human technology while teaching their rescuers about crystal cultivation and harmonic engineering. Captain Morrison retired from active duty after the mission and became the first human ambassador to the Calliari people. He often said that the rescue had taught humanity its most important lesson. True strength was not measured by the size of your fleet, but by your willingness to risk everything for others. The heroic sacrifice of the stabilization fleet was commemorated with a memorial orbiting Earth. The names of all who died were carved in crystal provided by Calliari artisans. Commander Hayes was posthumously awarded humanity's highest honor, and her final words became a rallying cry for the space service. News of the rescue spread across human space and beyond. Other alien civilizations learned that humanity had announced its presence in the galaxy, not through conquest or trade, but with an outstretched hand to those in need. It was the beginning of Earth's reputation as the species that answered every cry for help. The Calliari settlement of New Arxes flourished on the terraformed world of Haven 7, where crystal cities grew beside human settlements. Within a generation, young Calliari and human children played together in gardens beneath alien skies while their parents worked to build a better future for both species.